Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Coming up next is the 105th episode of Between the Covers, the 5th of the new year, an interview with Micheline Aharonian Marcom. But before we begin, I want to alert you to some new things about the show since the beginning of 2018. The show is still a listener-supported labor of love. You can still go to patreon.com/betweenthecovers and support the show. You will notice there that you can still get the fantastic co-written and out-of-print book, Vera and Linus by Jesse Ball. And as of the beginning of 2018, you will notice a growing archive of bonus material on the Patreon site, joining readings by Lainey Zumas, Yun-Sung Kim, Carmen Maria Machado, and Therese Marie Myatt will be two readings by Micheline Aharonian Marcom from her forthcoming books, The New American and Small Pieces. Again, you can check this all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is the Saudi Arabian-born, Los Angeles-raised writer Micheline Aharonian Marcom. Marcom is the author of 6 novels. Her first three Apples Fell from Heaven, The Daydreaming Boy, and Draining the Sea, form a trilogy that examines the Armenian genocide and its aftermath in the 20th century. The Daydreaming Boy was the winner of the PEN USA Award in Fiction, and her debut, 3 Apples Fell from Heaven, was a New York Times notable book, a finalist for the PEN Hemingway Award for First Fiction, and is currently being adapted to the screen with its opening night scheduled at Cannes as part of their Refugee Voices in Film series. Marcom's following 2 books, Mirror in the Well and A Brief History of Yes, both out from the Dalkey Archive Press, are the first 2 installments of Marcom's domestic trilogy, along with the still-to-be-published The Nothing on Which the Fire Depends. Micheline Aharonian Marcom is a Whiting Award winner, a Lannan Foundation Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar, the latter leading her to teach in Beirut, Lebanon in 2008. She's also the founder and creative director of the New American Story Project, whose mission is to foster humane, substantive dialogue around the complexities of migration, U.S. immigration, asylum laws, and the human rights concerns of new immigrants, and which is currently documenting the stories of unaccompanied Central American minors fleeing violence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, allowing them to tell their stories in their own words. Marcom lives in Northern California and teaches in the creative writing programs at Mills College and Goddard College, and she's here today to talk about her latest book out from Ost Press entitled The Brick House, picked by John Madera as one of his most anticipated small press releases of 2017. The Brick House is an illuminated book, a book of text and image about a house where people go to dream. Inspired by Calvino's Invisible Cities and Kawabata's House of Sleeping Beauties, as well as by Armenian illuminated manuscripts, Marcom commissioned Afghan-American artist and writer Fowzia Karimi to create 10 original drawings to accompany the text. Rikki Ducornet calls The Brick House fierce, fearlessly erotic, and always unforeseeable. And Carolina de Robertis adds, The Brick House is a work of piercing beauty and visionary power. With spare, exquisite lyricism, Marcom lays bare the raw hungers, horrors, and joys of human life as only the most enduring literature can. Welcome to Between the Covers, Micheline Aharonian Marcom.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you cite both traditional illuminated manuscripts and then William Blake's revival of them in a different context as influences for the Brick House. And I was hoping you could speak to the role of illuminated manuscripts as they were in religious texts, the ways in which you saw Blake recontextualizing them, and then how those two influences might inform some of your considerations in this book.
So I wrote this book a decade ago, actually, or I sort of conceived of it at least a decade ago. It took a long time not only to finish, but really to find a home, because I guess because in some ways it's a strange book. I mean, it is. I think of it as a novel, but it's not a conventional one, I suppose. There's no narrative through line. There's not a lot of. There's no characters really. It's not character driven, etc. But this is what I can remember. I became really. I mean, I'm interested in Blake's work, but it's really dense work, as you probably know, and there's something about the ways in which he sort of took this old, I guess medieval tradition and reimagines it in his own way. And makes these books. He himself saw visions, I guess, and so he writes these poems, and then they're matched with the visions, and then he developed new techniques as well to make the plates for the books. There was something so beautiful about that and about what he does, and how that they're not illustrations in his work, but illuminations. And so I guess I'm realizing in ways that one gets to know oneself better through the many years of making books, that I'm really interested in how image and text work together, and the space that opens up in the imagination when image and text are almost contrapuntal or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I often have included photographs in my work, and in this case, Fowzia, who is also a dear friend and an incredibly talented artist, was my student at the time, and I saw her work when I went to her house, and she often actually draws out of her dreams, and they're these really just whimsical, beautiful pieces, and I asked her at that time if she would illuminate this, because I have absolutely zero skill as a visual artist, which is why I often include photographs. But in this case, I wanted to try my hand at something like this because it's a book of dreams, and it seemed really, I don't know if conducive is exactly the right word, but it seemed like the right approach. And also at that time, I went to Yerevan. I think it was for the second time, and I went to the Museum of the Book. And Armenians are people of the book, and for whom books are very important. And in fact, during the genocide, there's all these stories of people who were sent on these death marches, and if they could carry anything, they carried the gospel. And many of those books are illuminated. And I got to see a bunch of them when I was in Yerevan. And you're not supposed to take pictures, but I had my phone with me, and I took all these pictures illegally and then sent them to Fowzia. And so that also was a part of looking at the old Armenian books, looking at Blake, thinking about Blake. Fowzia and I often would go to museums together and look at illuminated books and just working together in a way, although she completely came up with the artwork from the manuscript, a very early version. But it was also our collaboration. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
It does.
Yeah.
And there's this line from Blake where he says, awakening man from the sleep of reason.
Right.
And that seems to link this idea of illumination versus illustration, the fact that you're writing specifically about dreams. Do you think there's a connection between the difference between illustration and illumination and waking life and dream life, in the sense that a dream isn't going to be an illustration of your life, but it's going to essentially perhaps be an illumination through the ways in which there's gaps between what you dream and what you live?
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way. I mean, dreams are definitely heavily, we might say, image-driven, right, and symbolic in a sense. And they're strange, and they work with space and time in ways which are interesting and strange, much like novels can. which is what I love about the novel, that it allows for things to be together, adjacent really, that in the so-called real world are not, even though they're in relationship. And I guess I am interested in that, about how I sense these connections and relationships, and I don't see them in the world in a way. I see them in the world, I don't see them represented, and I often am trying to do that in my book. And I wonder if, too, like when I think about like image and text, I'm often seeking like how can, when you read something and you have that moment of the aesthetic shock, right, where the wonder or the awe or the re-seeing or the awakening, there's something about image and text together that I think forwards that, or something about it that it can happen. I mean, it does with Blake. And it's also never reducible, right? It's never, you can't reduce it down, as Carl Jung might say. The symbol is never reducible to one or two meanings. Yeah. And I love that, too, the possibilities for reverberation, outside of what he would call reason. Yeah.
So we're given a hint right away with the three epigraphs by Melville, Borges, and Eckhart that the book is going to engage with a relationship between the exterior and the inner or interior landscape, the inner and the outer. Eckhart says, "It is not outside, it is inside, wholly within." And Borges adds, "He understood that modeling the incoherent and vertiginous matter of which dreams are composed was the most difficult task that a man could undertake, much more difficult than weaving a rope out of sand or coining the faceless wind." I'm curious to hear just a little bit about your interest and or history with dreams. They've played a crucial role in other books of yours also. For instance, when I think of A Brief History of Yes, they believe they met through dreaming it into reality. So what compelled you, in this case, unlike your other books, to sort of construct a book of dreams? And what is your history with them personally?
About, I think, 12 or 13 years ago, I can't remember exactly, I went up to Port Townsend for the first time to teach at Goddard. Could have been more than that, maybe. And anyway, lots of things were happening in my personal life, and so I took a second job and I went up there. And the program was just starting at Port Townsend. And it's Port Townsend is pretty remote. It's about 2 hours from Seattle, and our program is housed on a former military fort. And when I got there, right before I left, I got very sick. And I didn't know anybody, and I flew up there, and I got really even sicker flying. I got there, and because I was so sick, I couldn't do what I was supposed to do when I was there. And I think I had to go up a day early for a training. But in any case, what ended up happening is the person who ran the program at the time took me to where I was staying. It was this huge brick building, which used to house the soldiers, apparently. And I was the only person in there. And it's enormous. I mean, just this enormous building. It's dark. It was winter. And they put me in there, and I was in there very ill by myself for one night because no one else was there yet. I can't remember. And that building was pretty terrifying in and of itself. It was like had that old terrible green paint on the inside that all those old military buildings had, and the fort was like really half abandoned. Anyway, that night I had terrible dreams. I had pretty much the worst nightmares of my life. It's maybe more than you want to know. But and the weird thing about those nightmares, they were very, very violent. But I woke up in the morning, and not only was I scared, I knew they weren't mine. I've had nightmares before. They were not my dreams. It was like, I just knew it. And wow. And then there's lots of stories afterwards as to what happened in that room. And later on, other people who slept in that room also had nightmares, and we even stopped using the building. But so as a person, I was like, oh, this is terrible. I hate this. But the artist in me, or the writer in me, was like, well, that's kind of interesting. It just got me thinking about how houses hold energies. And so none of the dreams that I had that night are in this book, but the concept came to me, the idea of thinking about, and I always, in each book, I'm always sort of keeping myself entertained, I suppose, or wanting to grow. And so I wanted to write a little bit more off of Kawabata, much more than Calvino, actually, although I know it says Calvino on the back cover. But Kawabata's House of the Sleeping Beauties, do you know that book? Mm-hmm. that book has so much to do with like a house, like, and what happens in the house. And I was, and suddenly I was like, oh, I want to do this thing about a house where people go to dream. That's where the idea came from. The dreams themselves, I forget now. They're all from different places. I don't know that many of them are mine. I was also traveling a lot at the time and going up to Alaska, the southeast of Alaska, and I had never really been in a wild place before where the bears are still there and the moose. I mean, so the megafauna are still there and in situ, as it were, and that really changed me. And I was spending time actually in the Hawaiian Islands as well. So, and there's some of those are in. So I was thinking a lot about environmental degradation. I was thinking about the plastics in the ocean. This is before people were talking about the gyre, which now I think people talk about the gyres around the world. Anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, and I wanted to ask you about incorporating dreams into stories, which in the most like conventional wisdom, that's sort of a contemporary taboo, right? So the argument being that it's as uninteresting to put a dream in a story as it is to hear a friend tell you the dream they had the night before. That there's no stakes, there's no rules in a dream. So how do you put dreams into a story? But even though I hear those taboos, for me at least as a reader, I still gravitate towards remembering the most memorable dream sequences in stories. I was curious if you had any acquaintance with either dream literature or literature that has dreams in it, or if there were craft questions or considerations for you in how you wanted to present them. I know you mentioned this one that you're looking at dreams within a specific space.
Mm-hmm. I guess I have heard that you're not supposed to put dreams in books. I don't know where I heard it from, and I don't know who made that rule up, but I don't understand rules for writing books. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think I've written a book where I haven't put a dream in. But, I mean, what makes a piece of writing good or interesting, or that's really the question. It's like, if we were musicians, we'd be like, well, can you bring it or not?
Right.
That's it. That's it for me. I don't understand. I mean, I always say to my students, I've been teaching writing for a long time now, 16 years or something. There's no manual for the making of a book. I mean, if there were one, I would sell it to them or tell them to go buy it rather and save their money. There's practice, there's apprenticeship, there's reading, and then there's one's own inklings, obsessions, visions. What is the project of literature? I mean, I think it remains like an artist's vision, and yeah, sometimes like there's failure. I mean, I'm sure I've failed many times, but at the end of the day, who can you really ask but yourself? Like, did I please myself? Did I do my best? And whatever one's individual sense of like integrity is, and those are really personal questions. Yeah. And the ones I think about a lot, actually. I mean, quite a lot. But I don't know. I don't understand when people tell you what you can and cannot do. I would never have written. I don't write books because I want to follow somebody's rules about what you can and cannot do. Yeah. I would rather make money in a corporation or something.
If you had to follow rules.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the interesting things regarding rules that I think is really interesting about the Brick House is if we think of dreams not having stakes or rules, or at least not having the same rules, they have a different logic than living. But the Brick House as a place where people come in your book to have dreams, it has a ton of rules. So even though it's a place where you go to enter in this other space with a different logic, there is a very explicit logic to the Brick House itself. In order to be able to go there and have your dream, you can't use sleep aids. You can't enter another dreamer's room. each visitor is only permitted one night. And I was just curious about that. If you saw that scaffolding as part of the house, like is that the way you house the dreams, by having this sense of exterior order to allow this sort of other order?
I don't know. I know that was there from the beginning. I mean, if I were to think of someone like Calvino, his process for writing The Invisible Cities, he has that essay about it. It's really wonderful. And he just wrote these pieces for years. And then eventually it kind of heaved it together and started to think about, well, how do they hold? And what's the form that holds them together? And then this conversation of Kublai Khan and Marco Polo and all of that. And the European imagination, in a way, which is so formed by Marco Polo, who then influences like Columbus and all these guys afterwards, who like come to discover the new world and see what they had read in a book, the fictions from hundreds of years before. I love that. I mean, it's like, what are we but a series of fictions, This is why I'm probably the worst person to answer questions about my book sometimes, is I have to go back and look. It's like, I don't know why I sensed that there had to be this outside structure for something which then has all of that, like fluidity and illogic. And then there has to be some way to follow, to read it.
Yeah.
So that even though I don't write books for any particular reader, books imply readers, and I'm its reader. But it was a really hard book to finish, maybe from that sense. Like I was always trying to find the right way to get that book to work, because each dream kind of has to work on its own, and yet it also has to have a unity and a coherence. And it was not obvious.
I'm hoping you'll read a little section about the structure of houses that are not the brick house.
My wife now carries my corpse back toward the house. The house is one of 100 such mythical structures inside of the walls of the island subdivision. The street directs us toward our dwelling, and each one measures the correct quantity of feet wide and white-lined and yellow dashes, and the proper manner to turn left, turning lanes, accompanied by lampposts and traffic signals at regulated intervals. Here the laws and lawns are ideally established, and the manicured green plots line up perfectly in front of every abode and are of the same species of fescue grasses that were first imported from the African savanna by Australian traders 150 years ago. The houses are like barricades, although they do not protect against the barbarians as the old towers once did. Rather, it is their duty to decrease the circulation of sight, which they accomplish mightily, just as it is the duty of the roadways to decrease the expanse of the imagination over the land on unformed and as yet untrod footpaths. The houses, walls, streets, bright lamps, and even the non-native sedge accomplish their considerable task with relative ease, which is, in reality, to screen from visitors and residents alike the nature of the island, just as pornography will distort for the viewer the true breadth and ecstasy of Eros. She brings me back here to my home, and now that I have died, I am able to see things as they are. The roles and set pieces of the theater I inhabited on the island during my lifetime. I can see the sham of it, its shabbiness, the empty comical gestures of my wife and children and all of my neighbors. Only the sunlight and warm archipelago air and moonlight and new green growth on vines and trees and the surf and seabirds remained unadulterated despite the developments contrary to their nature. And when the monsoon came, and when the waters rose higher than my 2-story house, and when the winds tore the roofs off of the houses and blew the tarmac out into the sea, and the sky came down in a tidal wave as the wind opened its mouth and held up its fangs to bite off the houses at their cores, the sea waters rising further, and the trees leaning down like giants with giant fingers to break, to cut open. Then it was that I understood not only how the weather would eventually remove the glossy sham and silly painted lines and rules and tightly corseted ladies with their ideas of what to wears and how to looks and how the children should behaves, but more than this, that it would release us, as it did my rotting corpse, back into a watery grave. That the island would eventually throw off its inhabitants and even its landmass and return like a child to the bosom of the mother, to the sea and the seafloor.
We've been listening to Micheline Aharonian Marcom read from The Brick House. So if we take this motif from the epigraphs of interior, exterior, and also what you were talking about the way place can manifest visions or nightmares. Obviously, a house can create an interior and exterior, and this idea that you present in this excerpt of houses being barricades against sight and roads against imagination, that the structures we build can either further or prevent seeing, or further or prevent fellowship and connection. And so these houses that you're describing are sort of the anti-brick house in a way. Like they're preventing seeing. They're intended to, even though the person telling us can see what they're doing, the people in them are intentionally sort of blinding themselves. And it reminded me of something you said once in an interview about your experience growing up in Los Angeles, of being a sense of placelessness or disembodiment, which I imagine you might argue arises from the design of the place.
Right. Or the lack of design, but then something.
Yeah.
I'm often struck by how, I don't know if you are, but I was recently in Texas, went to an art museum, and I'm forgetting the architect's name, but the museum, the building, it's a Japanese architect, was so beautiful. And we walked in, I was actually with Fowzia. We walked in, and like the way that the energy in the room was, because of the angles of the building and the glass and the light, you felt it. I felt it. So that is not how I feel most of the time inside of most buildings, and not how I felt growing up in Los Angeles, or even this passage here is inspired by a subdivision in Maui, and how the subdivision in Maui looks exactly like the subdivisions I grew up with in L.A., and they don't make me feel good. I mean, it was all I knew, so it was hard for me to even know that buildings, not only do they maybe have potencies and energies, but they affect us. They just, I mean, I'm not an architect, and I haven't even studied architecture, but just the ways in which these angles and the material and what they do to us, and also when they're constructed to be so out of harmony with the place on which they're, built, is also so strange, and then America's such a strange place. I mean, if I just speak of the United States, or where I live in, a pretty new settlement, is so strange. All of it's just so strange.
Yeah.
Things on top of things, and then we know, like in L.A., I knew nothing about Los Angeles. I knew nothing about California. I mean, I never learned any history about the place I lived in, which is it creates, what's that? I don't even know what the word is for this disconnect that is created when that happens. Because the land affects us so much, the weather, the light, and our abodes, You may know more about it than me, but
I don't.
I don't think, I think most of the time I don't think about it, because I just stop, we cut it off. But like every school I've ever been in and taught in, they don't make you feel good.
Yeah, the spaces are helping you cut yourself off in a way.
Yeah, from your senses, your body, your feelings.
Yeah,
it's.
I wanted to read the description of Babylon in the book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, and then ask you, because it feels like you're sort of presenting the brick house as an alternative way of seeing, like an alternate building that creates a different possibility of sight. So,
oh, that's nice. And anything I have to say, I mean, I'm sure this is not helpful, but like, I do all of my thinking in the writing, and I think that's why it's hard to articulate outside of it. What am I thinking? Because I'm really thinking in the writing, or as Morrison said, writing is inquiring. And so when I'm writing a book, I just do tons of reading and tons of research, and I go way in, and then I forget everything. Does that happen to you? I just can't remember it.
Yeah, I mean, that happens to me. But if you're forgetting everything, you're doing a pretty admirable job in the moment.
Good. What page?
I'm just going to read this to you.
Oh, great.
Actually.
Okay.
So this is from The Myth of the Eternal Return. The map of Babylon shows the city at the center of a vast circular territory bordered by a river, precisely as the Sumerians envisioned paradise. This participation by urban cultures in an archetypal model is what gives them their reality. And what's interesting to me, it's interesting to me that it also reminds me of this Ursula Le Guin quote that says, "Children know perfectly well that unicorns aren't real, but they also know that books about unicorns, if they are good books, are true books." And so we have these two quotes seem to be arguing that a world without the imagination is a less real world, and that perhaps a city is more real if it acknowledges the imagined. And I wondered about that in regards to this structure, that the brick house in the brick house. But also, like you talked about, how these structures, say in Maui, aren't reflecting the land, but maybe they're also not reflecting human imagination either.
Yeah, or very few human imaginations, probably whatever the forces were that brought those buildings into being. Economics, I'm guessing, as much as anything. Or
yeah. Well, what do you think about these two quotes that that put together the idea of the imagination and reality in a way when maybe more commonplace usages of both would put them as in opposition?
Whatever people call reality, to me, if you press on a lot of it, seems like a series of fictions that a lot of people believe in. Does that make them real? I mean, they certainly can carry powers and they can do all kinds of things, sometimes terrible things. But that doesn't make them true. I mean, we all agree to many lies, and as a collective, both nationally, internationally, et cetera. And I've always been interested in like pushing on and getting a sense of what you might call the real. Well, dreams are part of reality. We all close our eyes for several hours, hopefully at least 6 to whatever it is, 10 a night, and we dream. That's part of our reality. I don't think of it as separate from reality.
Yeah,
I don't understand those divisions, and I think they're false ones. And I think that, I think so much of what imaginative literature is trying to think about is, what is it? What is life? What is the real? And what are we here? What are we doing? And being witness to its times. And like realism as a style, often for me, is the style least capable of contending in some ways with, because of, for various reasons, of what it is, what the real is.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
That's, yeah. She's great, Ursula K. Le Guin. I was at a table with her once many years ago. I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was a really extraordinary person.
She was an extraordinary person.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really enjoyed in reading The Brick House is the way you describe the house. So contrary to this subdivision that you read us about, there's a lot of imagery around eyes and around seeing in the book. So the windows of the brick house look out like eyes. The house is described as having 13 eyes. We also get references to the blind prophet Tiresias, to a blind horse, to black-eyed salmon, to the moon as a white eye, all sort of connecting this idea of seeing or not seeing. So hoping you would just read a one paragraph actually on page 39 for us that would give an example of this.
Sure. This is from The Full Moon. I stand in front of my home with my neighbors in the city of B. The air is red-tinted, and I look up into the night-red sky and see the full moon. The full moon looks down at me with its white eye. There is no break to the looking and the looker, so that the moon is looking up at the moon, and I look down at me, and we are traveling out beyond the seeing, and death is looking, and no eye is looking, and happiness is there in the merger, so that the cosmic loneliness ends, and the looker looked, and seer seen, and light lighted, and we have spread out like a black galaxy bird in flight, so that the heart which feeds the blood, the lungs which oxygenate, I break the moon's hold, or the moon breaks from me, I from I. I am afraid to travel farther, and I look again to my neighbors, continue the story of my day, of loves denied, of the drama of lost employment, of the highest felt feelings of new purchases, new resentments, remembered slights, plumbing problems, recipes for chicken on the bone. The black white light galaxy behind the red sky, the full white moon still calling continuously.
Been listening to Micheline Aharonian Marcom read from The Brick House. One thing that somebody might not pick up on when they hear you read it is that you use these invented conjoined words, not just in The Brick House, but in a lot of your books. And so there are these negations. So the word in this case is no I, the word no, and the word I, not the I as in the organ, but the I as in identity, are one word conjoined. And you have a lot of these negated conjoined words: not seen, not dreamer, not volition, not dying, not eyes. And it made me think of the Adi Shakara quote that you employ that says, "For seeing things as separate is the sole cause of otherness." And the reason why I thought of it is because these invented words feel sort of like Zen koans in a way. Like, I wonder if by inviting the negation into the word, if that's different than negating the word. So by like allowing the negation into the word, if maybe that's hinting at the limits of language or the ways in which the normal use of language might inadvertently create otherness because it's not allowing that opposite somehow. Like, I was just curious about, I know I'm spinning off into my own theorizing, but maybe more simply, you could just talk about why you return regularly in your books to these words and what function you feel like or what effect they're producing.
I'm not sure about the effect. I mean, I want to just mention William Faulkner because I must. I'm pretty sure that was something I think I noticed in his work when I was obsessed with it a decade ago or 15 years ago. Something around a word and its, I don't know if negation or its opposite, which is not exactly its opposite, its unness. There was some real energy in that for me. And I don't know if it's that, that I myself, I don't understand things. And I have this sense that there's a lot of lying or half lying about things all the time in whatever our collective, obviously in politics, but not only politics. And I think sometimes I'm trying to get language to open to, again, that's probably a big Faulkner thing. He does it so beautifully, like to try to write about what I sense. And sometimes language, rather than really accessing what I think is true or beautiful or real, papers over it in a way. It obfuscates. And so I'm always like, how do you crack it open and make it do more and have this energy, or so that it allows us at its best to see again, to see anew, to not be complacent, not only in whatever in our lives, but really in our own imaginations, keep running down the tracks that we've gone down before, and then we're not seeing.
I wonder if these words that we've never encountered before and we're not quite sure how they function in the sentence, if something about creating that unknowing or not knowing or mystery is part of being able to connect. Like when you're talking about language, maybe a flatter language being something that would be obscuring to connection with the other or with otherness. If something about the tolerance of not knowing entirely seems to me connected to these words.
Yeah, and I just think that words get used or said or something, they lose their meaning. They don't really mean very much. Sometimes I feel like what I'm trying to do is re-energize a word, and it's hard. It's like the word genocide. That's like really almost impossible to use in a work of literature. The word pogrom, Isaac Babel in his story of My Dovecote. Have you read that story? Mm-hmm. It's just such a beautiful story. What amazes me about that story is how it ends on that word. It's there at the end, but the whole story has built us to the word. So the word has meaning again, or has vibration or something. It has energy, emotion, a sense of realness. And I feel like sometimes words lose that, probably through advertising and politics and the universities and whatever else. So I don't know, maybe that's partly what we're doing as literary artists, is trying to get words to have again the energies that are latent in them, but get dimmed. And sentences have to have it. It's, the musicality, the rhythm, and it's just like these vibrations or energies. I mean, they are sounds too.
Right. They're physical.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of my writing is following my ear at first. And then I spend a long time going, what does that mean? We got all those words on the page. It's like, it also has to, you have to get the meaning to come too. But sometimes I write things that I don't understand, and I'll think about it. And it's not like I don't spend so much time revising and editing. I do. But sometimes something has to be away because I just sense that it does, and I'll leave it.
Yeah. Well, if I haven't tired you out with readings, I'm going to ask.
No, I hope I'm just not reading badly. I'm just like,
No, you're
I'm
reading
going
great.
too slow.
If you could read, I marked out a section for you on page 21, which is sort of on this motif which we haven't really discussed around vision in relationship to nature, and I want to sort of follow down a little rabbit hole around this.
Okay, this is great. He was alone, and the landscape was barren of trees, but it was obvious to him that at one time there had lived many trees in this earth, and not because he could see the stumps of trees, for there were none, but because he felt the keen absence of the wind's arches and resting places, the unecho of bird songs and untrippings, not trillings from branch to peak, the insects unloudly unsuspended in midair triumph of leaves and trunk and vine. He was able to see the not seeable on the road by means of the shivers up his spine and the hackles raised on the back of his neck. And in this manner he could see animals and plants and men. He could see grief, and it was like the seam of the horizon, badly sewn, thick, blue, white, black, and scarred upon his cornea. The sun beat down upon the nape of his neck. He sweated. He felt ill. He wanted to vomit onto the tarmac and looked upon the black earth before him and the blue-white powdery sky above. Then the earth changed to resemble a black and white photograph, the kind that men used to make when they printed chemical images on paper, so that he saw a silver gelatin land and sky carved among shadows, in grays and blacks. Only the whites of men's eyes remained in high contrast. He continued walking, and the tarmac did not burn his feet, for he was used to such things as the perpetual absence of shoes, and so the soles of his feet had long ago hardened and cracked and dulled from exposure and use. A car drives past him, and then there are thousands of cars moving alongside him, and the cars move without drivers, for he remains the only man. They rush headlong toward the gray horizon and back toward some origin which he cannot see behind him, because here in this place there is no beginning, only the tattered seam in front of him, only the forward motions as he progresses, a pilgrim on an undirted road toward an end which is also unreachable, although he has been walking since early in the century, perhaps earlier even than that, since the beginnings of this new era. He is a city man without shoes or hat. He breathes deeply, and the car exhaust is bitter in his mouth and nostrils. The black soot collects beneath his nails and inside his nose and mouth, and as dew once did on the leaves of trees. He cannot stop his forward movement. It is as if he were a dynamo, mechanical, electrical. There is only motion. He is not sure why. He marches toward the black and gray skyline, toward an eschatology that awaits him there. He believes that he will reach his destination, and he will become rich and happy and live by the sea in a clean, tight metal fortress. What is the sea? He has by now forgotten about blue and water. The evergreen trees have also faded from his imagination. He forgets the tactile except for the tarmac slapping his feet, or his feet, rather, which push against the rocks and form tar. He has forgotten about his groin. He forgot many years ago about books and his family. He forgets about skin, loses his skin now on the pilgrimage. His organs shine outward to the black sky, but he cannot see it or tell of it, for his voice has dissipated, the vision snatched back inside the well of his white-black eyes. He smells the burning tarmac. It melts beneath his feet, and soon each step that he takes him farther down into tar and rocks, as if he were walking through black, thick, and burning cold snow. He continues the journey. He is determined. He will arrive at the apogee one day. He knows it, he can smell it, for he has mysteriously retained his sense of smell. He smells his stink, he smells the car exhaust. The cars have also vanished from the scene, but they too persist in their absence. He is the blind, mute walker. He heads toward his destiny with a grand gesture. What awaits him there? If the man were not blind, he would be able to see two things: his liver protruding from his spine like a hunk of gray-brown cheese, and in the distance, a towering gale. It runs down the road as if a naked fury. It is possessed and writhes. Perhaps it is his mother. He had a mother once, and he was once the young, proud, triumphant son.
We're listening today to Micheline Aharonian Marcom read from The Brick House. So, I mean, one of the threads that I see in this book is sort of an alienation from the imaginative and also an alienation from place that these people who come to seek out this one night of dreaming are responding to, in a sense. But also the book is very explicitly about environmental destruction. We get the life cycle of a red plastic coffee stirrer, and we get the subtropical gyre in part of the book, a phenomenon that has a dreamlike name but is a very real thing that no one is engaged with. So it's another place of not seeing this fantastical but very real thing in the ocean. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, I read about your trip to Alaska being part of this, informing this life cycle of plastic. But also maybe you can just talk about the subtropical gyre, which I'm sure most people don't even know what that is, and what it's doing here.
Yeah, and there was something you said, David, right off the bat that was interesting that I wanted to say something about.
About the alienation from the imaginative and from place.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, it's, and I think that is what the book is thinking about in some ways, and in some ways the way that I know it is because of my experience as an American. There's an experience of, I mean, yeah, I guess we spoke of it, of this alienation from place and the ways that maybe it's our economic system. You know, I mean, I walk around, I'm like, this is crazy. Like these fictions of the things we're doing, they make no sense. Plastic. It's completely nuts. To have a stir, I mean, there's a dream in the book because I was fixated on it, to have an object which will last 50 to 200,000 years or more and have its use be at the time of stirring it in your coffee and then throwing it away. It doesn't go away. You know, the Earth is a biosphere. I mean, it's like, and so I think a decade ago when I was writing this, I started just thinking about things like that. Because when I was up in Alaska, we found plastic and like tennis shoes from Japan. I mean, we were hundreds of miles. We were just miles from any other human settlement, and there was nothing nearby. And then I realized that our planet is a small, deeply interconnected place. I had that experience traveling by boat 2 different times. That like the illusion of the city, the illusion that food is in a market, you know, as if it weren't built on an extremely complex system of interconnectedness, relatedness, and of course we have these economies. And I just knew it. I was like, this can collapse. We're not seeing it. You can live in a city in the buildings and then all these styles and clothes and everything we get obsessed with, and it's like, it can all really quickly, you know, it'll go. I mean, now we're seeing it, and people are talking in this way now, but this was before I was not seeing it so much in the main news, and then I became obsessed with the gyre. Now there are people who have talked about it, and there's quite a bit of reporting on it. I mean,
can you tell us what the gyre is for people who don't know?
There are many of them, and let's see if I can remember. The gyre that's near Hawaii, which is the one that I became obsessed with, near meaning like not next door, but it's close to it. I can't remember how many miles. It's closest to one of the atolls, which also is in the book, that I think the United States owns. It's about the size, or used to be about the size of Texas. And it's these places on the earth, in the oceans, where however the patterns of the ocean are, they become dead spots, or where things are not moving. And they're filling and are filled with plastic. I mean, just filled like feet down of plastics. The thing about plastic is it just gets smaller. It doesn't go away. And so the birds are eating it, the fish are eating it, the whales are eating it. I recently wrote a small piece on this whale found, I can't remember where, and and animals are like dying of starvation. They opened up the whale's guts, its stomach, and it had like, an engine cover, 800 plastic bags, a hose, a bunch of children's toys in the gut of this one whale.
Yeah.
And there are many gyres now. I don't have the exact figures on, all of them or where they are, and they're creating havoc.
The thing that scares me about us as humans and the imagination around this is it seems to me like we can get excited as a species about trying to come up with a technological fix. Like we'll figure out a bacteria that we're then going to unleash that can eat plastic in the ocean.
Right.
Whereas it would require no technology at all to just stop making plastic. We've our entire existence on the planet, like 99.99999% of our lives have been without plastic. So it would just require a backing up, like a restraint, which seems like particularly complex for humans to do. Like we seem to, I don't know if we're wired, or maybe it's just corporate capitalism is wired this way rather than humans, because I could imagine maybe other cultural iterations in the past wouldn't have been wired this way. But I wonder when the solution from a logical perspective is a simple solution. It's very simple.
I know. Many things, and that's why children see so clearly, right? Because they see it. They're like, why are you doing that? That's crazy.
Yeah.
Why would you put poison into your food and then eat it? It doesn't make any sense. But this thing you're saying about restraint, no, we don't restrain. I mean, that dream is about that. It's like a forward movement. It will play out. There's no, I believe we can change. I do. And I believe consciousness can rise and things change. They can change. But we're not good at restraining ourselves. And I don't think other species are either. I mean, that's one thing. And you talk to my biologist friends, and that's not like the strong suit of many species. Like, I'm going to restrain myself.
No, probably any species would try to do, take over their habitat.
Right. But we're an interesting species. We're very young. I mean, how long have we been around, Homo sapiens? 200,000 years, maybe a little bit longer. Very young. And we're like on the brink, whatever that brink might be. Maybe it's 500 years out, I don't know, of disaster. And maybe it's 50 years. We are exceptionally, I mean, we only walked out of East Africa, they estimate, 70,000 years ago and walked all over the earth and then made boats and this sort of thing. But then we have this capacity, which is the imagination, which I don't know that other species have language, and I'm not diminishing any other species. I don't believe in this dominion thing at all, but there's something about this thing that we have through the imagination and language that is extraordinary for good and, for things that aren't so good. We will organize around these fictions, which maybe, not so great. I mean, like, what is racism? It's a fiction. Like, we're the same species. All of it is fictionalized invention. I mean, I'm not saying a lot of horrible things don't come as consequence. They do, they have, and they persist. But it doesn't make them true. It doesn't mean they weren't based on a lie.
Well, I want to take a strange, I don't know if it's a detour or a pivot, but I want to see about a connection in this book between. So we have the dreaming, we have the environmental destruction, the absence of seeing in physical structures, and we also have this connection between. Which seems like a connection between the love and the sex in the brick house and the story of nature's destruction in some regard. Because it feels like the way that love and sex are portrayed is as if love has seasons, as if it has a life cycle. And we're going through the life cycle of a red plastic coffee stirrer in the book, but we're also going through the life cycle of romantic love. We have chapters titled Love, New Love, The End of Love, The End of the Love Affair 1, 2, and 3, The End of the Marriage. And much like in your previous book, The Brief History of Yes, the brick house feels like it's creating this nexus to me, like a love, nature, dream nexus. So in The Brief History of Yes, it was barnacles and songbirds interwoven with a relationship falling apart. And then dreams were playing a role in how the relationship came together. But I didn't know if you had any thoughts on, the subtropical gyre, the earth growing sick from us, and this sort of life cycle like iteration of the beginnings and ends of romantic relationships in the brick house.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I don't know if I can answer that question because I haven't thought about it like that, and that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that's maybe what time and good reading and distance gives. But I always write these books from like deep inside, and then slowly try to come up, and then go, okay, well, it has to work as a book, and it's got to have like. But it doesn't mean that I know why some things are together in a way either.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about them in the way that I think in this.
Well, the way that I experienced the dreams in relationship to this partly was because it feels like this book, it's about love and solitude in a way, but it doesn't feel like it's just about solitude post-love, but it also feels almost like the solitude of post-nature. Huh. Like if there was no more out there, if all you had was the interior of your own mind, so you're in sort of the negative of, like the negative version of a dream, like you were trapped in sort of your own self-reflecting narrative back to you, the solitude of that, of not being confronted by otherness. Because when I think about that, brings me back also in a way to those strange words you create. When I was talking about how maybe there's something about them being beyond our grasp, like we can't entirely understand their function. If there's something important about there being actual things in the world that are not, whose function we don't entirely understand, if the not knowing is part of fellowship in a way in the world. I don't know where I'm going, but
I don't know, because I don't know either. I mean, I think that's what. Whatever the great sense of awe and mystery that one has, even just like with the moon. Like, did you see the eclipse recently? I didn't see
the lunar eclipse.
A friend of mine did, and he's a photographer, and he said he had this moment. It was so extraordinary, but he didn't take a picture, even though he had his camera. He just was in it, in that exchange of whatever happens when we're really present to the natural. I mean, we're always in the natural. We are of the earth. We are earthlings. But somehow we have this capacity, I guess, because of this imagination or whatever we do and our language, to reflect, to Rilke would say, to praise. What are we here to do? Praise, to look, to be the seers and look not just at each other, but at our planet, at the earth, and see it. It's so beautiful. I've been reading Coleridge's notebooks, and he spends a page on a fern. Just the beauty. I mean, there's so much beauty and wonder in so many of the Earth's systems, animals. I mean, just like plants. Like, what is photosynthesis? Does anyone really we don't? What is it? What is gravity? I mean, you think about these things. It's like we don't know. We're here and we're witness, and we're incredibly innovative and smart animals, but at the same time we seem anxious and fearful, and that anxiety and fear gets pushed into ways which are dangerous. It tends to consolidate, I guess, movement towards some people having power, a lot of power over other people, and this is, I think, not good. I mean, I'm reading The Master and Margarita right now. The book is all about that, the day the devil comes to town. Well, the devil shows you, the devil, there's a quote. Do you know this book at all?
Yeah, I love that book, actually.
I love this book, too. I haven't read this translation. But that his epigraph from Faust at the front, going off here a little bit, but I was just reading it on the airplane, and made me think of Donald Trump, actually. So the epigraph to The Master and Margarita, which is, this book that took 10 years to write, and it's basically about authoritarianism in a way, and Stalinism, and many other things. It's extraordinary, by Bulgakov. But at the front of it, it has an epigraph from Faust, right, from Goethe's great book, which I can never finish for some reason because it's so hard. But anyway, and the quote is, Faust asks Mephistopheles, the demon, he says, "Who are you then?" And Mephistopheles, the demon, says, "I am a part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." I don't know why when I read that, it's something that I don't, it's like that way of just getting us to move out of how we think and think, like, does the evil that he says there, and that's why I thought of Donald Trump. I mean, does Donald Trump just reveal us to ourselves?
Right.
This is who we are right now. This is what we've done. That's part of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking about how, like, when he did the State of the Union address, apparently they were running advertisements of his corporate donors on the website, so you could watch the address and see who was giving him money. And I was thinking, well, we get upset about that. It's terrible, but in a weird way, that is something that's always happening.
Right.
Regardless of who the president is.
Of course.
And it's just an issue of decorum.
Right.
In that regard. I'm not saying that that's the only difference between Trump and these other presidents, because there's
no, but he makes you see it.
He makes you see some things that we're pretending aren't there.
Exactly.
Also.
Yeah. I mean, I've for years I've been struck by, in the New York Times, you've been reading this article about a genocide in Rwanda, whatever, when that happened. And then there's an ad right next to it for diamond wedding rings. I mean, it's weird. Just like those weird things.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a continue.
I know. You might want to cut all that from this, but I just think about, like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. We need to see it. We are on a collision course, but we're not necessarily, but we have to see, and not just how we treat one another, but how we're living. And he displays to us our greed, our vapidity, our narcissism, our obsession with fame.
Yeah, he embodies.
He does, and he doesn't pretend otherwise.
No,
and that has been growing in this country. I mean, reality TV is like, all this. So maybe that'll be the good that comes. That people will be like, no, this is not. We are not going to do that. We are going to choose differently. We have free will. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I wanna take this idea of seeing, of structures that prevent seeing or further it, of our awareness around place or a lack of awareness around place, around this issue of environmental destruction, but also here when we're talking about even the embodiment of certain things in the body of Trump. I want to talk about bodies in relationship to this narrative, and then maybe just wonder about whether there's a link between the absence of bodies in certain narratives and maybe our absence of seen nature. But there's a nested doll quality to the book. So where the physical structure called the brick house is mirroring the physical book called the brick house. Each room of the house is labeled with a letter, number, and a pictograph, a system that sort of mirrors the text image structure of the physical book. The house has 7 rooms. The book has 7 chapters. Even though we are talking about dreams, we're also talking about dreaming bodies. It's bodies who come to the house to dream. The house serves as a body, but it also is described like a body that houses dreams. It has eyes. So you did this interview with Jason DeYoung at Numero Sank, and you mentioned how you noticed how many books there were where the body doesn't exist, where we are with a disembodied mind throughout the entire book. And I wondered about your maybe your aesthetic orientation around this, because you write a lot. I would call your writing embodied, not just when we're talking about sex and love in the book, but but particularly when we're talking about sex in the book, I would say also. So do you see any, talk to us a little bit about the body in literature and like what you've noticed absent and what you feel like you're doing.
I haven't thought about that in a while. I think in my early years, I was like, where's the body? And particularly the body of women, probably, because I was raised Catholic, and even outside of that, just there's as relates to the body of women, there's so much, and that's all being talked about much more now, but less so then, even with feminism and in the 80s and 90s and sort of when I was going to college, but just the shame around the body, and particularly for women around a woman's vagina, and I've always, like many things, I don't understand that. I mean, sure, I get it, but it's like, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So I think I wanted to, it's like the mirror in the well, right? Sort of have the bodies and have the terms for a woman's body, which I don't even think I can say on the radio. Why shouldn't they be in literature? I mean, some of the oldest art on earth, as far as I know it, are those stones in the form of the labia of a woman, just like those beautiful sculptures of the Virgin, whatever, they're 30,000 years old. So I guess I probably had like this, project. Put the bodies back in, both bodies, male, female, the bodies. And not just that, but it's like, they're making me think about these things. I haven't thought about them in a while, but I don't, so there's ways in which, like, what I guess Jung would say, like, we have these personas and the mask that we all wear. And in my books, I've always wanted to be like, well, why can't everything should be, why is this censored? The whole thing as it is. Like, see the world as it is. That includes what happens when you close the door, or who you are when you're not in front of people. And not just your shadow side, but just the multiple parts of being a human.
That's where I felt like this was connected to environmental destruction, strangely. Like,
that's interesting.
How much what we're willing to see and describe and what we're not willing to see and describe. Like, you say, what's behind the door? Or I could say, what's out in the ocean that we're not looking at?
Right.
But you also, in that same interview, you quote D.H. Lawrence in an essay apropos of Lady Chatterler's lover.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes this connection that feels like a connection between the body and nature. And I'm just going to read it and see what you think. The body's life is the life of sensations and emotions. The body feels real hunger, real thirst, real joy in the sun or snow, real pleasure in the smell of roses or the look of a lilac bush, real anger, real sorrow, real love, real tenderness, real warmth, real passion, real hate, real grief. All the emotions belong to the body and are only recognized by the mind. And then later, Lawrence also says, the Christian religion lost in Protestantism, finally, the togetherness with the universe, the togetherness of the body, the sex, the emotions, the passions with the earth and sun and stars. I thought that was an interesting and not necessarily obvious direction that he takes there. Of connecting those two. So in a way it feels natural and we don't have to unpack it as much as I would have imagined that we would see this questioning about what we're seeing, how we build our houses or our roads, and what we're ignoring around plastic isn't necessarily a different question than are we willing to have our characters have bodies?
I mean, probably every writer and, it has his or her, I guess Emerson would say kind of like plot of soil that she's tilling. And for some reason, that's been part of mine. I mean, I love those essays by Lawrence, and they kind of turned me on, 15 years ago when I first read them. And he was railing, at the early part of the 19th century, 20th century. And I think it's because the ways in which we're taught, we have to be taught shame, and we have to be taught to be unintegrated. We are, you look at a child and like they're there, all the storms blow through, they're angry, they're this, they're that, but we have to learn. And so much of the stuff that we learn, then you have to try to unlearn, because you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Whose idea is that? And what's it for? And where does it come from? Like the origins of ideas. And so many religious ideas, maybe not the teachings of some of the beautiful teachings that come through in the main religions, or religion in general, and these myths, but the structures, those religious structures, are often just about control. When you look at women, the role of women in Catholicism, it's like control, and not just controlling women, controlling people in general through these sets of ideas.
Well, let me return to the very first excerpt you read, where you said, the houses, walls, streets, bright lamps, and even the non-native sedge accomplish their considerable task with relative ease, which is in reality to screen from visitors and residents alike the nature of the island, just as pornography will distort for the viewer the true breadth and ecstasy of Eros. I think of this in contrast to the Lawrence. So the Lawrence is talking about, it's a kindred sentiment, essentially, but it's the opposite. So it's talking about the ways we disconnect ourselves. But it also reminded me of your appearance with Michael Silverblatt on Bookworm for Mirror in the Well, and he was very enthusiastic about the book. But at the same time, he described aspects of it as pornographic. And I was curious what your response was to that. Because here we're looking at you're putting pornography on the side of like suburban housing structures that blind us. And you're putting like the brick house or this museum you described where the light comes in and you feel different on the same side as Eros. I was interested in that book in particular, and how it was received, or your impression of it with regards to this question. As you're reclaiming words, as you're describing explicitly sexual coupling.
Well, okay, so let me see if I can keep my train of thought here. But the thing about pornography that I don't like, and I'm not opposed to it, but the thing I don't like about it is that it does what D.H. Lawrence says. It basically does dirt on sex. It makes sex dirty. And that's such a diminishment of sex. I think sex in all of its possibilities, whatever they may be, and some involve the spirit and the high connection of love, and others are just pleasure and ecstasy in the physical way. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but to do dirt on sex, that I don't like that. I guess I would say. And I don't remember that Silverblatt interview. I don't think The Mirror in the Well is pornographic in that sense. I think pornography, different from erotic fiction or erotic films, like I think the one of the best films I've ever seen is In the Realm of the Senses. And they're, having sex, the actors are, through much of that film. Have you seen that film?
I haven't, actually.
It's unbelievable. Why? It's so true. It's so honest and so beautiful. And it's really intense. It's about sexual obsession. That's kind of a real thing as far as I know. And that some people thought it was pornographic. But for me, pornography, not just the dirt on sex, but lies about it. I have so rarely seen a film of porn, and I've watched porn, and the women are not aroused. They're not. They're not aroused. So that's a lie.
Right.
So they're moaning and groaning,
right.
But they're lying. They're acting. And so that's the other thing. It's filled with lies and half-lies, like a lot of TV. It's really, L.A., Hollywood, it's like, what is Hollywood and pornography? I actually think of them to me, they're just the same side, different sides of the same coin. They're very similar. And they both often, not always, there's probably some great films coming out of Northridge, I don't know, but or maybe Hollywood. But they're sort of in the same terrain. They're dealing in lies and half-lies and fantasies and all this stuff to make a buck.
And have you seen Godard's Histoire du Cinéma, the 8-hour
No.
collage history of cinema?
No.
It was on TV in France in like the 80s.
Oh, really?
Because the premise of it is looking at what Hollywood showed while the Holocaust was occurring, essentially. And so he puts these images
Wow.
and then shows you like
Right.
Sid Charisse and
Watch In the Realm of the Senses, if you haven't seen that film.
I want to. We watch lots of Japanese films, but I'll have to convince my wife on this one.
Amazing, I think. Not everyone does, but
Yeah.
when it was shown at Cannes, people walked out.
Yeah.
It's intense. I mean, it's a very intense film, but it's, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, why is sex pornography? You know, or what? I mean, what I think obvious is like the worst pornography is the violence in film and TV. Violence as entertainment to me is pornographic, or whatever the term is. It's not right, and I'm in a minority, including my partner, who's like, I love it, and I'm like, I don't like it. I don't think it's right.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be used as an entertainment in that way.
Well, there's a line that I just copied down because I loved it so much in The Brief History of Yes, the silent, unlanguaged tongue of her interior that felt both sexual and more than sexual. Like, it's not, I don't know, it was a beautiful moment for me.
Which is kind of like literature, what it does at its best. That made me think, I was having this conversation with my undergrads the other day, and this is probably what got me writing books in some ways. I don't know if it did you. Is like to read a sentence in someone else's book or sentences, and they don't have to be anything like me through their gender or culture or language, and you read a sentence or scene or something, and they have articulated what is in your own interior, your own, and maybe you didn't even have it in a sentence in your interior, you just felt it, and then it's sentenced, and then there's a recognition. And that kind of recognition, that's why literature for me is just so extraordinary, because it crosses time and space and culture and language, and it's revolutionary, as Blake might say. It has this incredible capacity to increase not only our cognitive ability, but our empathy.
Yeah.
We walk, in each other's shoes. We really do. We are. I just read Zora Neale Hurston's wonderful masterpiece again, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And every time I do, it's just extraordinary and such a joy. And she so captured that moment, that language of the times, 1930s, Eatonville, Florida, African-American. It's like, what a beautiful thing, what a gift.
Yeah. I'm going to take us possibly down a tangent, but I want to, you can pull me back if I go too far.
Yeah, I'm the one who's like tangenting out.
As much as we're talking about bodies, love, dreams, the life cycles of a life or a relationship, there are many ways in which it feels like the human is nevertheless decentered in The Brick House. There's no protagonist. There's no plot in the traditional sense of plot.
Right.
The characters are unnamed. And I was wondering about the origin of this. And so one of the places I went was when I had Talia Field on to talk about experimental animals. We talked a lot about her desire to work against our compulsive need to center the human and the personal in the frame. That part of the way she was channeling her concern for the environment, for the non-humans on the planet, was by trying to create new story forms where humans were only a small part of the frame and not in the middle. So I wondered about how that struck you. But then I also wondered if this was just accommodating the logic of dreams, which by nature are associative and nonlinear and, aren't based on like a hero arc of a protagonist with a story. And
even in our own dreams, we're this character, we're that character, you kind of move around. Sometimes you're a protagonist or an eye seeing, and sometimes you're not, I don't know. That's interesting about Talia. I just met her recently and looked at and read that book. I don't remember, I can't remember what that initial choice was, but I think it had something to do with, there's a male dreamer and a female dreamer. The book also, when I was writing it, I was thinking and reading a lot at that time about, the archetypes and myth and those and stories that pull out of having an individual character with his or her psychology, which is, since or whatever, the last 100 years. I mean, I guess since Madame Bovary is like, books all have to be about a psychology. And it's like, well, no, they don't, but it's a great book. But I mean, sometimes, people think that's, books do all kinds of things. And so maybe it's also part of me, like, experimenting and playing and thinking and all, I've done different things in different books, depending on what a book takes up. I mean, so its story, its content, say, or whatever it's inquiring into, and its form are in this, relationship.
There's a section on page 107 that I'd love you to read, because for me it felt like sort of evoked this idea of framing, of human framing, of us sort of helplessly putting ourselves at the center of the frame.
The old man sits with his brother at the dining table and eats his dinner from a tin can. Soon he sees each thing truly. 2 brothers in front of him, 2 wives in the kitchen, 2 cans of beer, 2 cans of meat on 2 tables. The 2s then become ones again, but ones he can no longer distinguish. They are like blurred charcoal drawings. The wife, the can, the beer, the brother, the table no longer have sharp lines or limits. Then his feet lose all feeling, his tongue goes numb, and his mouth makes slurred words like his eyes make blurred images. The eyelids begin to close, and then for the closure he cannot see. His mouth opens and his tongue pushes out, and from his stomach the bile comes forth, and he has vomited onto his trousers and shoes and the table. He stands, and then he cannot stand. He is sitting again, and then he cannot sit. The muscles of the body quickly remove themselves from any kind of response, and he lies like a stranded sea animal on the edge of his Outer Banks dining room. He is losing the movement of his fingers. Now the lungs begin to undo their up and back movements. The liver does not circulate. The spleen is white and becoming fatter. The can of meat stares at him from the table. The small animals that were inside of the can, brought from abroad as an uninvited souvenir, smile congenially. Happily they trip around his bloodstream like girls skipping down a lane. The small animals lived in the dark, unoxygenated earth. The small animals traveled a long distance. The small animals ate his nerve endings like he ate the canned meat. The ambulance rushes him to the hospital. His wife holds his unfeeling hand, touches the unfeeling eyes. Machines push his lungs open and closed. With each machined breath, there is oxygen moving into the blood and waste moving out of his mouth. He is traveling in the river of his own blood. He is having the dream about the man who tries to run and cannot run. The machines push his lungs as Sisyphus pushed the giant boulder up the mountains, only to see it fall down again. Then he is running very quickly, as if he were flying almost, for he has awakened on a football field in America, and he is the football star, and the game is mid-play, and he sees in the crowd of onlookers how his mother and father hold their hands up into the air in the form of the conquering V. His wife is happy, his brother is relieved, he is V.
Been listening to Micheline Aharonian Marcom read from The Brick House. It just made me, it was chilling to me, that section. Like, for some reason, this idea that we're all inevitably going to think of ourselves as the star on the football field in our last moments on Earth.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, there was something pretty powerful about that.
I wrote that dream a long time ago, and then, do you remember we had that outbreak of Ebola?
Mm-hmm.
And that freaked me out, because that's like an Ebola scenario, and I wrote the dream way before that happened.
Yeah. Have you read that book by David Quammen?
No.
Called Ebola?
No.
It's very short. It's like 80 pages, and it's amazing as a story, too.
Wow.
Like, you'll be on the edge of your seat, and you will not stop till you finish.
Wow.
It's amazing. And speaking of not seeing, we don't talk about, like, the huge number of gorillas that were killed by Ebola. Like, so people were walking around in the forests seeing just all these dead bodies of gorillas.
You're
and
kidding.
The way it first started was a tribe taking infected meat of a gorilla back to the village and eating it.
Right. I knew it had jumped from primates.
Yeah.
But they had it first, and they also suffered it.
Terribly.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a ton of gorilla Ebola victims.
Wow.
So,
and there's not that many gorillas
No.
in the wild.
No.
I don't think it's even 2000, right, or something.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, to come back from that tangent, you have a remarkable number of books on the horizon. So I was wondering if maybe you'd be willing to tip your hand on some of them. Like, so for instance, I was curious. I'd love it if you would talk about the New American Story Project on its own, but also if you could talk about it in relationship to your book, The New American, presuming that there is a connection between the two.
Yeah, there definitely is. So The New American, which will be out, I'm not sure, end of 18, probably likely early 19, Verso's publishing it, is a book that I wrote. I started it in 2012. And at that time, I was doing a bunch of research about Mexico. I've written about Guatemala before. And I thought I was going to write about the drug wars in Mexico and what was going on there, because it seemed for Mexican writers and journalists, so many were being killed. And as I read about it, I thought, I want to write about this, or think I ought to, or something. But then as I did more research into Mexico, I started following the story of Central American migrants who cross Mexico, because Central Americans, predominantly from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, who are coming north, fleeing for their lives, because that region called the Northern Triangle has become one of the most violent places on earth. I mean, the states are basically failed states. They can't protect their citizens. Gangs, drug cartels, corrupt police, ineffective judicial systems, etc. So people, if you're a woman, the rates of femicide are much higher than Mexico. I mean, there's no protection for women and children. So anyway, people are leaving, running out. It's a humanitarian crisis. But when they hit Mexico, it's a very dangerous place for them, because they were undocumented from the time they come into Mexico, and many people, drug cartels most notably, the Zetas and et cetera, are taking advantage of them. And so all the smuggling is now run by the cartels, and so anyway, people want to get a dollar out of everybody in every way they can, so people get kidnapped and extorted, and these are poor people who are coming, mostly. But so I started doing this research about migrants, and then I ended up writing a novel, which is The New American, about an American kid. He's Guatemalan American, and he's a dreamer. This is before anyone talked about the dreamers, because it was quite a while ago. And he gets deported. He's lived in the United States his whole life. He's a UC Berkeley College student. Traffic infraction. He finds himself in a village in Guatemala where his parents are from. They had fled the Civil War. And he decides, I'm going to go home. I got my life there, and he has a girlfriend, and he's in college, and he decides he's going to go back. So he's kind of the guide for the book, not having no idea what he's getting himself into, really. He just gets on a bus, and he's like, he had talked to somebody in the town. He doesn't realize that things are changing quickly, because this is the time when the drug cartels are changing the whole smuggling routes and the whole thing. So he gets to Mexico. He meets up with 4 Hondurans, and it's the story of their coming back. They ride on the tops of the cargo trains, which is very dangerous, as many people did. And so anyway, it's a very narrative book. Unlike every other book I've ever written, it starts in the beginning, it goes to the end, and Emilio, the main character, it's like a close third person on him. Because I just felt like, this is a story that demands this kind of storytelling. So it was different from anything else I've ever done. When I was writing that book, like as with all my books, especially the historical ones, I do lots of research, but I couldn't read any books about it because it was in the moment happening. So I did all this research on YouTube and crazy things like that. I didn't go to Mexico. I was afraid to, actually. I don't know. And as I did tons of research, and I speak Spanish, so I could read the papers in Mexico and El Salvador, et cetera, and tried to find all these. I learned so much from hearing people's first-person accounts. Like I did the same thing when I wrote 3 Apples Fell from Heaven about the Armenian genocide, people telling their own stories in their own words. And there wasn't that much. There was some, but not that much. Just like there wasn't that much at the time. This is before the whole Dreamer movement started. And so when I finished that book, I was like, I want to start a project so that when this novel comes out, which has taken a long time for other reasons, that there's a project whereby people can tell their stories in their own words. This is a novel. It takes, it does things through the imagination that novels do, but I wanted the project to be a way to record the voices of refugees in support of telling their stories in their own words. And I know I'm going on here, but probably in a little bit, like my grandparents were refugees, my grandmother, and orphan. She was an orphan. And, so much of my work has been like trying to write in what wasn't written in some ways, as I understand it, her story, among others. And I thought, well, why can't we I'm alive now. I can listen and record stories. So the New American Story Project came out of that. It came out of a class. I took some of my grad students into a local high school to do a creative writing class. It turned out 28 out of 29 of those kids were refugees from Central America. They were part of that crisis in 2014 where many children came because the violence was spiking. And the project has gone on and developed, and now there are 3 of us who work on it. And, part of just in many ways kind of like my novels, I've thought a lot about how do you tell a story that's emergent digitally so that it can be more available in the moment and maybe not take years to get it out into the world because you can do a story more quickly, but do it through video, through audio, through monologue, working with other artists too, and just trying a different way to tell stories, but all through people telling their own stories. So we don't just interview the kids anymore. I've interviewed 44 people, and half of them are actually like immigration attorneys, people who work in those countries and who are anthropologists or humanitarian activist workers. So because the kids actually, when I talk to the kids and I've interviewed them, they can say, this happened to me. They actually often are not able to put it in a larger context. What happened to those countries? How is it connected to the United States? What's the legal process in the United States? I mean, the lying and obfuscation right now as immigrants are being targeted, used as political pawns. I mean, not only does it make me sick, but it's it is so inaccurate. It's just this base manipulation, to use another for, in the ways that we know. But, and I just feel like, well, you just try to tell things as they are. This is how the law actually works. Like we have asylum laws for people. If you arrive at our southern border and you say, I'm afraid, there are laws that protect you, and there's due process for those people. Thank goodness. This comes out of the Second World War.
So the New American Story Project people can interface with now, but is the New American your next book coming out?
Yeah, so the New American will be my next book, and that's not going to be out for, 10 months or something. The New American Story Project is online, although I'm redoing the website right now, which will be up in like 6 weeks. We are now working with, instead of just grad students doing it on a shoestring, I'm working with a designer, and it'll look better, be easier to move through.
Yeah. And what are you working on now?
That. I can't tell you how much time the New American Story Project takes.
Yeah.
And I have to finish final edits on the New American. And so when both of those things are done, I have a novel that I'm halfway through that I haven't returned to in about a year about a woman and her double I'd like to get back to. I have a 17-year-old who's going to go to college, so I work on that too.
I bet that takes some time.
Then teach.
Well, it was great having you on Between the Covers.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really great to be here.
Talking today to Micheline Aharonian Marcom about her latest book, The Brick House, from Ost Press. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO. Volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Micheline Aharonian Marcom's work can be found at michelinemarcom.com and also at the Between the Covers Patreon page at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where she reads excerpts of her 2 forthcoming books, Small Pieces and The New American. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog E Sapatita Mi, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/ Barbara Browning.